What fascinates me about money is not just what people buy, it is what they trust. For most of my life, the answer to that question was very simple. The world trusted the United States dollar. It trusted the Treasury market. It trusted the American financial system to be the deepest, most liquid, most dependable place to park capital. When the rest of the world looked uncertain, that trust gave America extraordinary. It let America borrow more cheaply than almost any other country. It let America run deficits that would break weaker systems. It let America print and spend with a margin of safety no one else really had. And because so much of global trade, reserve management, energy settlement, and cross-border finance ran through the dollar, the United States did not just participate in the global system, it sat at the center of it. Now here is the part most people miss. When a system has been dominant for a very long time, they stop noticing it. They treat it like gravity. They assume it is permanent because it has been present for as long as they can remember. That is exactly when change becomes dangerous. Not because change must be dramatic, because change can be slow enough that ordinary people ignore it for years, then suddenly wake up and realize the environment they are investing in is no longer the one that created their old assumptions. That is where I believe a great many investors are standing today. The phrase people use is changing world order. It sounds theatrical. It sounds like something designed to sell newsletters and stir emotions. But underneath the loud language, there is a quieter truth that matters very much to your money. The world is becoming less singular. The United States is still powerful. The dollar is still central. American markets are still deep. American businesses are still among the strongest in the world. But the system is no longer moving toward more concentration in one place. It is moving toward more competition across several places. If you hear that sentence and conclude the dollar is about to collapse tomorrow, you have learned the wrong lesson. If you hear that sentence and conclude nothing is changing at all, you have also learned the wrong lesson. The right lesson is more subtle. The dollar is not necessarily facing an immediate replacement. It is facing a slow reduction in exclusivity. That is a very different kind of risk. After the Second World War, the United States emerged with unmatched economic and military strength. The Bretton Woods era, and then the post-Bretton Woods dollar system that followed, reinforced a world in which the dollar sat at the center of reserves, trade, commodities, and finance. Countries needed dollars. They held dollars, they settled in dollars, they borrowed in dollars. Oil was priced in dollars. Crisis capital fled into dollars. That arrangement gave the United States what economists like to call an exorbitant privilege. I prefer simpler language. It meant America had more room for error than most nations ever get. But privileges have a way of creating complacency. If you can borrow cheaply for decades, you become less disciplined. If the world keeps buying your paper, you stop asking how long they will remain so willing. If your currency remains the default, you begin to assume it will always be the default. History is not kind to that kind of certainty. So what changed? Not one thing. Several things. First, the sheer weight of the world economy shifted. The United States is still enormous, but it is no longer the only engine that matters. China grew into a system-sized force. India kept compounding its demographic and economic relevance. A wider group of emerging economies began to account for a larger share of world output. Trade, consumption, and capital formation. The world became more multipolar in its production, even if not yet fully multipolar in its financial plumbing. Second, sanctions changed the psychology of reserve management. Once a major power saw that reserves could be frozen, every country outside the inner circle learned the same lesson at once. They did not need to love one another to arrive at the same conclusion. They only needed to realize that concentration in one reserve asset carried strategic risk. Third, technology lowered the barriers to building parallel payment rails. Not perfect alternatives, not full replacements, but enough alternative channels, bilateral settlement arrangements, local currency trade agreements, and cross-border systems to reduce dependence at the margin. And that phrase "at the margin" is where nearly all serious analysis begins. People love all or nothing stories because they are emotionally satisfying. Either the dollar is untouchable forever or it is finished next year. Reality is usually more profitable than that, because reality is usually more nuanced. You do not need to replace the dollar outright to weaken its centrality. You only need the rest of the world to use it a little less often, trust it a little less automatically, and build a few more ways around it than existed before. That is already happening. The dollar still dominates foreign exchange transactions and global payments. It still leads reserve holdings by a wide margin. it still sits inside the deepest capital market in the world. In a genuine panic, money still tends to move toward the United States, not away from it. That is why I do not take seriously the loud stories that treat this like a sudden collapse. They misunderstand how large systems actually lose altitude. They do not fall out of the sky in one dramatic second. They descend in stages, a little less share in reserves, a little more local currency settlement, a little more gold accumulation by central banks, a little less willingness to finance someone else's excess without asking harder questions, a little more diversification by investors who used to think the American market was the only sensible place to own risk. That is how old monopolies become strong incumbents, instead of total rulers. The United States dollar is still a very strong incumbent. It is just no longer unchallenged in the same way. Now, think about what that means as an investor. If you spent the last 20 or 30 years living through one of the greatest runs in the history of American financial assets, it is very easy to let recency become philosophy. You start with a result and mistake it for a permanent law. American equities outperformed. American technology dominated. American markets absorbed the bulk of global attention. Passive flows reinforced the largest winners. The dollar system stayed intact enough that even people who distrusted American politics still trusted American markets. When that has been true for long enough, people stop diversifying intellectually before they stop diversifying financially. They do not just own too much of one country, they think too much inside one country. That is the risk I care about here. Not simply portfolio concentration, narrative concentration. If all of your assumptions about the future require the same structure that produced the past 2 decades, then you are more fragile than you think. Now let me be clear about something. I am not making a case for abandoning the United States. That would be foolish. America still has extraordinary advantages. It has world-class capital markets. It has extraordinary universities. It has a culture of innovation and risk-taking. It has powerful companies in artificial intelligence, semiconductors, biotech, software, aerospace, and finance. It has unmatched market depth. It has reserve currency inertia, and it has a military and institutional footprint that still matters enormously in how trust is distributed around the world. That is why I do not believe the intelligent response is panic. The intelligent response is adaptation. And adaptation begins by noticing that the future may not look like an extension of the last bull case. Vanguard, J.P. Morgan, Fidelity, and other large institutions do not all agree on everything. They never do, but the direction of their long-term return expectations has been sending the same quiet message. U.S. assets may still do fine. They may even do very well in absolute terms, but the gap between American assets and the rest of the world is no longer being priced as if it can widen forever. International equities start from lower valuations. Emerging markets have more room to grow. Demographic and industrial shifts favor a broader map of winners than the one many investors grew used to. That does not mean every emerging market is attractive. It does not mean every international fund is a bargain. It means the burden of proof has changed. You no longer need a heroic argument to justify having some of your capital outside the United States. You need a stronger argument to justify pretending that one nation can dominate every category forever while debt rises, fiscal discipline weakens, and the rest of the world keeps building alternatives. That is a very different posture. Now let us talk about China, because this is where the loudest misunderstandings live. There is a popular style of commentary that takes one real trend and stretches it until it becomes fantasy. China reducing treasury exposure becomes China dumping the dollar. CAPS expanding becomes a complete replacement for the global dollar system. BRICS discussions become a functioning monetary union. One macro pressure point becomes a headline that the United States has already lost global trade dominance. That is not how I think China matters, because it is large enough that its direction affects the world. It matters because it has been reducing reliance on dollar-centric arrangements at the margin. It matters because it has built institutions and payment channels intended to support more renminbi-linked activity. It matters because if enough countries want a little less dependence on the dollar, China does not need to provide a perfect substitute. It only needs to provide a usable partial alternative in certain relationships. That is enough to change the trajectory over time. But trajectory is not the same thing as victory. China still faces capital control issues that make many reserve managers uncomfortable. Trust is not built by size alone. It is built by openness, convertibility, legal predictability, property rights, and confidence that money can move in and out without political interference. The United States still enjoys major advantages on those dimensions, even with all of its fiscal indiscipline. That is why the most likely story is not replacement. It is dilution, not dollar extinction, dollar share erosion, not American disappearance, American normalization. The same applies to BRICS headlines. Investors love a coalition story because coalitions create the impression of scale. But coalitions are not always coherent. A group can be important without being unified. It can represent a great deal of output in purchasing power terms without yet creating a clean reserve currency alternative. It can matter geopolitically while remaining incomplete financially. Again, nuance is where the money lives. So how do I translate this into an actual portfolio approach? First, I do not go all in on the United States. That does not require me to become anti-American. It requires me to become pro-optional. I want exposure to the American engine because I still think it remains one of the strongest engines on earth. But I do not want to pretend that every good decade everywhere else is somehow already owned by U.S. large caps. A portion of my capital belongs in international exposure. A portion belongs in emerging markets. Not because I know precisely which one will win first, because I do not need to know. I only need to know that the world is broadening and that valuation matters. Second, I want some exposure to neutral stores of value and hard assets. I have never been one of those people who thinks gold solves every problem. Gold does not produce cash flow. It does not invent products. It does not hire brilliant people and compound retained earnings the way a fine business does. But when central banks buy it aggressively, when reserve managers seek assets outside the sanctionable dollar system, and when debt and money creation remain part of the global backdrop, gold deserves more respect than dogmatic equity investors sometimes give it. Not worship respect. The same logic applies, to a lesser extent, to certain commodities and real assets. If the world order becomes more fragmented, supply chains become more political, and the dollar loses some of its monopoly convenience, real things regain strategic value, energy, metals, transport corridors, and critical inputs begin to matter not just economically but geopolitically. That can shape returns. Third, I do not abandon U.S. innovation. This is where some investors go badly wrong. They hear a persuasive case for diversification and then behave as if the American innovation machine has stopped working. It has not. If anything, the concentration of talent, capital, computing, infrastructure, and public market depth in the United States remains exceptional. Artificial intelligence, semiconductors, biotech, cloud, enterprise software, defense, adjacent technology, financial infrastructure. There are still very large fortunes to be made owning the right American businesses. But the lesson is not to own only them and assume the currency, valuation, and market share backdrop will always be as generous as it was. The lesson is to own them as part of a I stay humble about timing. This is crucial. Large world. Order shifts do not pay on your schedule. They pay on their own schedule. A great many investors discover the right theme and still lose money because they demand instant validation. They buy the right story at the wrong valuation, with the wrong size, in the wrong emotional state, then call the thesis broken when the market takes longer than they hoped. That is not investing. That is impatience wearing a thesis. If I believe the world is becoming more diversified in growth, capital allocation, and reserve behavior, then I do not need to bet my future on 1 quarter or 1 year. I need a structure that lets time work for me instead of against me. That means broad diversification, reasonable position sizing, avoiding leverage, owning productive assets, rebalancing when extremes build, and remembering that no thesis deserves worship, not even a good one. Finally, I keep one idea at the center of all of this. The dollar does not need to die for your portfolio to need adjustment. That sentence alone could save a lot of people from making expensive mistakes. If you wait for a dramatic dollar collapse, you may do nothing until the relevant repricing has already happened. If you assume the dollar is permanently untouchable, you may ignore a slow change that compounds in the background for a decade. The real investor's job is not to wait for certainty. It is to respond intelligently to probability. And the probability I see is not a sudden end to American financial relevance. It is a world in which America remains strong while the rest of the world matters more than it used to. It is a world where dollar dominance bends before it breaks. It is a world where international assets may have more room to surprise than U.S. only investors want to admit. It is a world where reserve diversification, central bank gold buying, bilateral settlement systems, and emerging market growth do not destroy the old order overnight, but chip away at its exclusivity year after year. That is enough. Enough to change return assumptions, enough to change diversification logic, enough to change how a serious investor thinks about concentration. So no, I do not think this is a sell everything moment, and no, I do not think the United States is finished. I think something more subtle and more important is happening. The world is getting bigger than the one-country trade. And if you understand that before it becomes obvious, you give yourself an advantage that most people will only recognize in hindsight. That is how great shifts usually work. They look noisy in real time, then inevitable in retrospect. My job is not to predict the exact date the old order ends. My job is to prepare while the old order still works, but the next one is already being built. That is what I would urge you to do with your own money. Own America. But do not worship one country, respect the dollar. But do not assume it will own the same share of the future it owned in the past. Study the rest of the world. Because if the next decade belongs to a broader map of winners, the investor who adjusts early will not need to panic later. He will simply let the world get bigger around him and own a piece of that growth when it arrives.